All right, looks like we're recording. We're good to go. All right. So, continuing our discussion of looting kind of leads us naturally into right into our next topic, which focuses on museums and the questions of who owns the past. Um, so, on the other side of the debate of undocumented digging or looting that we just looked at are those who kind of see archaeology as a legitimate enterprise that can benefit a broader public audience. And a major piece of this side of things are museums, which obviously represent institutions that can provide public access to objects of the past. Um, but while museums certainly offer just that, there are kind of murky waters about how museums obtain and choose to display certain objects they hold, and questions are ultimately raised as to whether they hold any better claim to owning these objects than anyone else. So that's kind of what we'll be looking at today. So we'll start with a little history lesson looking at the development of museums as we know them today. Interestingly enough, museums began to take shape originally during the Renaissance. These were initially private institutions when there was kind of a renewed interest in classical art and architecture, which then drove wealthy merchant and banking families to form collections of art and various goods as kind of a marker of status symbols. So it's at this time you see kind of a huge increase among the well-to-do who sought to amass large collections of classical art and ancient artifacts. Royal families, across much of Europe, used these collections again to basically show off their wealth. And these would have included, cabinets of exotic, beautiful, or kind of curious objects from faraway places. And then they would, occasionally they would open these up and show, their generosity by opening these collections to the public. But these were more like private study collections than kind of the art and science museums most of us know today. So it wasn't until the end of the Renaissance period, going into the scientific revolution, that museums started to emerge as places for kind of research in the natural sciences. From this point in time, this intellectual movement of museums as places of curated arts and science aim to make sense of a world that kind of from the perspective of an increasingly globalized society, world where kind of these vast corners of the globe were now connected, was revealing new things that demanded new explanations. And these museums or collections offered a place to do that. So, at the same time, it should be pointed out that it's still true that many of these institutions, these original kind of museums, were built off donations from these earlier wealthier families, and at the same time kind of stood on the backs of movements of nationalism and colonial expansion. So they kind of had this, these different intentions, although there's still kind of this legacy built in with kind of elitism and colonialism. So museums often include references to classical temples, which alludes to the fact that they were still continue to be seen as spaces of protection and prestige. I think this is a clear example of cultural appropriation as well. Also, museums often incorporated or showed materials alongside nationalist images. So even if this is just a flag flying above the building, it's worth pointing out, right? It's kind of interesting. So the nationalist imagery here above the entrance within this picture makes it clear just who controls the materials within. In the case of the British Museum, most of these materials are coming from colonies or former colonies. So again, the point being here that there's this kind of dark side to museum collections. If we look at it that way, that often, they often originated as tools of colonialism. So it wasn't until we kind of go away from Europe, looking at the US, it wasn't until later decades of the 19th century when wealthy patrons in a rapidly kind of expanding American cities began to emulate these European models. So this is why we see many museums within the U.S. that mirror this European style. These kind of temple-fronted facades, over grand staircases and so forth. And as we continue to see museums change and evolve through today, we see these same kind of principles of elitism, colonialism, and nationalism are fading, although not disappearing. And from this comes a lesson in that museums themselves offer rather fascinating insights into the past. They offer reflections of the world in which they were produced, in a sense, thus offering lessons to be learned from themselves, not only from the objects that they house, which is a really kind of fascinating point of view. So this idea that museums in and of themselves kind of have this broader message to be learned from, I think was summed up nicely in a quote from one of the readings, the reading by Starsman, who talks about this kind of activist archaeology. So as she puts it, and this is a quote directly from that reading, the removal of objects from their original context and their management in museums' collections plays a crucial role here that is part of the political project of modernity. Once pulled from their life world by collectors, objects come to contain an essential meaning that holds its place within the universal hierarchy of values. And the historical narratives displayed in museums are really only productions of museum itself. So this adds up to what she describes as object manipulation, where curated materials are managed in ways to fit nicely within categories of chronologies, typologies, taxonomies, etc. So in these cases, archaeological knowledge is essentially being presented in a way that makes them understandable, controllable, in a sense, which is certainly understandable and perhaps a reasonable endeavor if we're going to make sense of them. But this process also unavoidably creates a kind of an authoritative position, authoritative historical truths by way of managing objects. Starsman then kind of goes on and kind of extends this argument to say that this way of managing and representing objects and knowledge is employed particularly by powerful governments as a institute of colonialism and a motivation or kind of validation of imperial actions. So the underlying point here is that the objects themselves are not only representative of colonial practices, right? Those objects, more often than not, were taken in some kind of colonial kind of context, but they're also often displayed and arranged in a way that can kind of have underlying colonial and imperial implications. So an example of this is the fact that displays often remove cultures from modernity, creating this sense that they are removed from the complexity of our contemporary lives and thus kind of primitive. And through this kind of underlying sense of removal from modernity and creating this sense of primitiveness, it's in a way justifying any type of colonial actions or encounters that kind of government might be undertaking. So not to get too carried away here, but this can be related to different ways of knowing or understanding the world around us, wherein these kind of scientific ways of viewing and understanding the past are seen as natural, even though there exist other paths to knowledge, such as portrayed here in a comparison of indigenous knowledge with scientific knowledge. So for example, scientific knowledge places emphasis on didactic methods of imparting knowledge, so that is kind of methods of teaching with moral instruction as an ulterior motive. These often use kind of formal methods, formal education, often based in writing, whereas an indigenous form of knowledge is thought to be often learned through experiences and to rely more on oral traditions rather than writing. So bringing this back then to museums and collections, as Starzman would put it, by supporting a scientific knowledge of the past, countries create what can be considered kind of a hegemonic narrative, which claim to kind of be transcendent in objective ways of knowing. So then Starzman directly recognizes, she does kind of recognize this distinction, but she is, I would say, slightly pessimistic that we can do anything about it. So I've got another quote. So she puts it, a radical critique of our own practices of knowledge production, where our theories as tools to know the past can be directly utilized to act in the present, goes in the right direction, but is not enough. So an important point made by both of these readings was that he who owns the past owns the present. The past, in this sense, is a powerful tool in many regards. So, of course, museums are not the only people who we're talking about or should be talking about when it comes to actually owning the past. So who all can own the past, or kind of make claims to owning the past? So the reading by Young, we'll turn to that here. He does a great job of kind of dissecting this, thinking about the different groups that can make claims, and we'll discuss that here. So the first are individuals. These can include those individuals we've discussed this far, private, both private collectors and individual institutions as well, such as museums. So museums would be included in this category. Another idea is that archaeological finds are part of a patrimony of a nation. So this is the view adopted by the government of Mexico, for example, which Young does talk about. So in this case, Mexico claims ownership of all pre-Columbian artifacts and goods within the country. And this is actually, and I know we've talked about Mexico before, but this is not an unpopular stance by any means. Other countries in South and Central America have the same policies. Places in Europe as well, such as Scotland and Denmark, have the kind of position that all archaeological finds belong to the crown of that country. So again, not a unique stance by any means. Even here in the U.S., we have policies such as NAGPRA that, although they don't give ownership to the government, our government, they do give them, in a sense, jurisdiction to say what happens to those materials. So it's, in principle, a kind of similar way of viewing ownership. Alternatively, cultures can view, individual cultures or groups that can be labeled as distinct cultures can claim to own the past, such that anyone claimed to be part of a certain culture or descendants of a certain culture can claim to own artifacts which originally belonged to that very culture. So this sounds somewhat intuitive, but it's actually quite complicated. And I think mainly due to the fact that culture is somewhat tricky to define. And as Young does a nice job of addressing, we can't expect cultures to be so neatly defined through kind of these long periods of time. So I think that's a radical assumption that cultures are kind of same throughout time, throughout these kind of long 1,000-year time periods. So making those claims is not as straightforward as it sounds. And finally, the fourth group that can claim ownership is it's the idea that archaeological materials can belong to all of humanity. So the example here that I've got a picture of is UNESCO. UNESCO standing for United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. And this stands as a good example since it classifies items of tangible cultural property as the heritage of all nations of the world. So part of Young's objective is to determine of these groups just listed, who exactly has the rights or rightful claims to owning the past. And the way he describes it, in a way, can be broken down as a game of who can kind of claim the most value out of past objects. So he first presents us with two alternative approaches to claiming ownership. The first of which is the idea of inheritance. So inheritance can go two ways, universal inheritance or group inheritance. Universal inheritance is this idea that past materials belong to all of mankind. It's a type of shared good. I think this sounds like a good idea, but the problem here is that if everyone has an equal claim to some item, we may say it belongs to everyone, but kind of the other side of that is at the same time, nobody has control or ownership. So at the end of the day, someone needs to own it, right? It ought to belong to somebody. So there's sounds good, becomes problematic though. So what about individual cultures? Can they claim inheritance? Individual or group inheritance is the idea that we can trace ownership of an artifact from its original owners to a member of some contemporary culture. But again, there's problems here, mainly, again, this idea that it's really tricky to show clear connections between past cultures and modern cultures. Culture is, again, tricky form of identity to really clearly define, and one that's certainly constantly in flux. So then extending it between the past and present, again, is extremely tricky. The other point that Young makes is if groups claim inheritance, what about the people that left these objects behind? What would they say? How can we prove that this is actually what they wanted of those objects? Who's not to say, for example, that we may have wanted the remains to have been owned by, they may have wanted their remains to be owned by the wealthiest or most powerful. Kind of an absurd example, but it makes a good point, right? Like we can't say, if we're thinking about this in terms of inheritance, we can't actually say what was wanted of these items. So in the end, unfortunately, the inheritance approach is out, both universally and for groups. The other approach to claiming ownership of the past is what he calls the cultural value approach. So the second approach takes us as its starting point the claim that the archaeological record of the past has value, and then encourages us to ask under what ownership can these items have the most value for all humanity. So again, we can think of a universal and group approach to claiming value, similar to the way we did for the inheritance approach. But again, for the same kind of reasons, it's hard to actually see any real benefits coming from a universal ownership. Essentially, nobody owns them, so nothing can be done realistically. So maybe a way of reframing it then is to think of in what context can the objects in question be of most value, since they're not going to be universally, seems kind of unattainable that they be of value universally. The conclusion here is basically that instead, in some cases, certain artifacts can have tremendous value for some groups, distinct groups, and with that value comes a natural and ethical way of claiming rights to ownership. And Young makes the point that this is particularly the case for portable goods. So most often these groups are cultural groups, leading Young to what he calls the cultural property principle, where an archaeological find has special significance or value for the members of a distinct culture. So in this case, the value has to be genuine, right? It cannot be kind of artificially constructed or cultivated. Otherwise, anyone could claim to have value in an artifact. This seems to be kind of for me, a roundabout way of saying you can have inheritance, but I guess the point that he would make is that inheritance is kind of a de facto claim of ownership, where you have to prove. Here you're having to, cultural group is having to prove that they have value in those objects. So in this case, rarely, if ever, can individuals claim ownership under this kind of cultural value approach, simply because if an individual sees value in it, is not good enough, because the argument being that the objects have a higher degree of value within a larger group of people than would be the case with an individual. So what about my collection of arrowheads? I've got stored away as singing at home. Can a group come in and just simply claim that they have more value, and then therefore have rights to take them? So this is a question that Young addresses. And for cases like this, he makes the distinction between items that are abandoned and those that are clearly wrongfully appropriated. So items that are discarded or abandoned can be owned by anyone who finds them. So in this sense, no, these items, such as your arrowhead collection, shouldn't be taken away from you under normal circumstances. Being the caveat, you can think of caveats being how you came to own those objects, where exactly you found them, what exactly those objects are. Those are going to affect the value. So the argument here is that arrowheads, they were discarded, right? They weren't being kind of curated. They didn't have value, and so they were kind of left. Therefore, you have value in owning them. Maybe if you have a ton, that changes things, right? That might be one of those situations. But just looking here at a handful of arrowheads, nothing is inherently wrong with that. But there are objects that can appear to be abandoned that cannot be owned. So there's some, it's important to be clear here. And this is something in these kind of situations where, an object, even though it appears to be abandoned, was not. This is something he would call appropriation. So he gives an example of this, talking about the Zuni war gods pictured here on the left and in the bottom. And these are created once a year by the Zuni, and after their use are kind of secretly hidden away in various places where they kind of left to naturally decay and decompose, where they're thought to kind of slowly return their powers to the earth. So you can imagine someone kind of stumbling upon these while they look like they've been abandoned. They're actually playing an important role in their state of supposed abandonment. And thus the argument is they cannot be taken, as they often have. The same, I think, can be kind of comfortably extended to the idea of NAGPRA here within the US, where burial and ritual items are protected under the ownership of Native American groups. So these items are different because they were not simply abandoned, right? They still have ongoing significance. The ritual items, burials, things of this nature, right? They still have ongoing kind of importance. Therefore, right, they can make the distinction that you cannot own them. Those who find them cannot own them. So this last example or last slide demonstrates that there's some caveats to this idea of the cultural value, in the sense that not just anyone can kind of claim significant value, and that claiming value isn't always a clear-cut way to winning this kind of game of ownership. So we can extend the card game metaphor beyond the cultural value to other situations where different rules can potentially win out. So Young gives kind of 4 alternative principles here. Starting with the conservation principle, this is seen as kind of paramount to the other 4, and states that the possession of an archaeological object should be put in the hands that is best able to preserve it. So obviously an object is useless if it's unable to be preserve. So sometimes a culture is not the one, even though they can claim value in it, a culture is not the one who can best preserve objects, and the appropriation of the objects may be morally correct in this situation. So the appropriation by groups or individuals who don't have kind of inherent cultural value in it is okay. However, these situations are flexible, right? And just because a museum, for example, has a better ability to preserve an object at one point in time doesn't guarantee their ownership in that object forever, right? Say a cultural group might come to a point where they are able to kind of then take that item back and house it in a appropriate location. That's you can certainly think of an example where that might occur. So the next principle is the access principle, which states that objects should be placed in possession of those who are willing and able to make it accessible to all people who to whom it has value. So he gives an apt example here of objects that might be stored away in basements of museums that alternatively might have better use and value elsewhere where they could be displayed. Third is this integrity in principle, which is the idea that objects should be placed where they can maintain their highest integrity. So the example here is when you have objects that have been physically separated, there's more value as a whole piece, so that they should be united under the ownership of one place. They should be brought together, right? Integrity can also refer to the fact that items have more value when left in their place of origin or their place of discovery. And this might be the case for larger items that can be protected, but often smaller items, the point is made, smaller items are harder to preserve in their place of origin. So more often than not, these things have to be moved away in order to better preserve them. And then the final principle is this proprietary principle, which basically claims that people who find objects might not own them, but they at least deserve to be recompensated if they do not have, if they do eventually have to give them away or kind of relinquish their control to a rightful owner. All right, so I'll wrap things up here and try to come to some conclusions. So the readings, while addressing some of the same issues, so we have these two readings, and they obviously are addressing the same issues of who owns or who has rightful claims to the past. The major questions within them kind of be separated into who has rightful ownership of the past versus who has ownership over knowledge and the reproduction of knowledge. Or kind of put another way, who literally owns the past and who figuratively owns it, in the sense that, you know, the way we understand it, the way we study it, interpret it, etc. So the piece by Young was very concerned with this physical aspect of ownership, but Starzman points out that there is power beyond just the physical ownership that extends to a power of owning, you know, the way we understand and interpret the past. And again, I'm brought to her. She has this great quote. I believe it was in the conclusion of the paper, and it's, you know, it says, "He who owns the past owns the present and may make claims to a country's resources." So we're presented with this kind of unfortunate situation where the ownership of material past has its clear kind of beginnings and roots in acts of colonialism and imperialism. And even though most of these kind of clearly colonial acts have been put to an end, there's an ongoing you know, what she kind of refers to as neo-colonial, neo-imperialism through the continued management of these artifacts and goods by these institutions, previous colonial institutions. And, you know, even with what Young provides us, this kind of clear outline of the best way of deciding who owns the past, the kind of the direction forward, the best direction forward in deciding what happens to these materials is still rather contentious and not really clear at all. All right, so yeah, we'll end it there.